that is caused naturally. Okay. What about Godi? I don't know, I've forgotten your first name. Yes.
It's unforeseen occurrence.
Okay. Unforeseen occurrence of something, right? Something that you can't predict. Okay. So you're not far from the definition, but then the best definition is that when talking of a disaster, this is a serious disruption of a functioning of a community. It is a serious disruption of a functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous events. It is a serious disruption of a functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. A serious disruption of a functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: a serious disruption of a functioning of a community or a society due to a hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, or capacity. So these conditions may lead to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental loss and impact. It will lead to human, economic, material, and environmental loss and impact. What does this definition tell us? Whenever there's a disaster, okay, if we want to say this is a disaster, it should be something that is serious, something that has caused a serious disturbance or a serious destruction, a serious damage in a community or society. That serious damage should lead to a certain society not to function the way it was functioning. What do I mean when I'm saying that functioning of a community, a serious disruption of the functioning of a community? A community is supposed to function. There are a lot of roles of a community. There is production, there is developmental activities. People are doing developmental activities in the same community or society. But then there comes a disaster and destroys and disturbs this functioning of a community, whereby because of a certain disruption, people are not able to go and do their productive works. People are not able to sit together and do community activities together and discuss, maybe plan for the future together because of a certain disturbing condition. So if it's a disaster, it should lead to a serious disruption of a community, whereby sometimes that disruption or that disturbance can lead to economic loss of lives. It can lead to environmental loss because it's something that is serious. That's a disaster. And a second terminology is large-scale disaster. I'll start with small-scale disaster. A small-scale disaster is one of the type of a disaster that only affects a local community, which requires assistance beyond the community's control. A small-scale disaster is a type of a disaster. But then this disaster affects a small community. It affects a local community, whereby that impact of that disaster will require assistance beyond the community capacity. Okay, that means there's a certain disaster in a certain community. Let's say in this community before Area 49. Yes, in Dandili. Okay, let's say there's a disaster in Dandili, but then if that disaster only affects Dandili, it means it has affected a small area, right? But then people in that community are failing to cope up using the available resources to cope up with the impact of that disaster, and then that impact will require assistance from other communities, from other members from other communities. That's a small-scale disaster. It only affects a small community, but it will require help from other communities because the members of that community cannot be able to cope up with the impact using the available resources on their own. And then we have a large-scale disaster. A large-scale disaster is the opposite of a small-scale disaster. A large-scale disaster affects a large area, but then the assistance comes from the nation or international assistance, because it has affected a large-scale area. We can just say it has affected a society. Okay, so you need assistance from the nation or international assistance. That's why you see that maybe in Ukraine there is war. That's a disaster, right? They need help from other nations to help them with maybe the basic needs. So we have here in Malawi, we have Nsanje, whereby Nsanje is a large area. If people in Nsanje are affected with floods, they will require help from the nation or international assistance to help them to cope up or to get out of the situation that has come due to a certain disaster. That's a large-scale disaster. Are we together? And then we have a slow onset disaster. So when talking of a slow onset disaster, it is a type of a disaster that before I move to a slow onset disaster, I've skipped frequent and infrequent disaster. So I have to look at the frequent and infrequent disaster. Frequent and infrequent disaster will depend on the probability of occurrence and the return period of a given hazard and its impact. So in terms of the frequent and infrequent disaster, we are depending on the probability of occurrence and a return period of a given hazard and its impact. So, what do I mean when I'm talking of frequent disasters? There are other disasters that happen frequently in the same community. I'll keep on using Nsanje. Nsanje is one of the areas that is most often affected by floods. Okay, so that one is a frequent disaster. So it will take time for people to recover whatever they lost due to that disaster. So if we're talking of frequent and infrequent, we are looking at the occurrence and the period that it takes to retain whatever they lost due to that hazardous event. So if we're talking of frequent, think of those disasters that happen frequently. And when talking of infrequent, there are disasters that happen, but then not that frequently. Maybe it takes 5 years for a disaster to occur in that community. That one is infrequent. And then for infrequent, people will be able to recover whatever they lost, because it takes time to experience another disaster. So in terms of frequent and infrequent, we are looking at the probability of occurrence of a disaster and the period of return of whatever they lost due to a hazardous event. Are we together on the frequent and infrequent disasters? Then you have a slow onset disaster. This one is defined as the one that emerges gradually over time. They emerge gradually over time. A slow onset disaster. Gradually, but then over time. And then it's when we experience that disaster. They emerge, they develop. Okay? So one example of a slow onset can be droughts. We can talk of desertification. So for desertification to occur, it takes time, okay? Gradually you develop something, and then at the end of that you experience a disaster. So what causes desertification? If people are cutting down trees, the end result will be desertification, right? So it happens gradually over a period of time. That's a slow onset disaster. You are told not to cut down trees, or if you cut down a tree, you need to replace it. But then let's think about Chikangao. Chikangao was one of the famous forests in Malawi. Panova Zilibati. Well, finished all the trees because we are not replanting, okay? We are not doing reforestation. What will be the end result of that? People around Chikangao will be experiencing a lot of disasters. One of the disasters can be floods, because trees helps us to cover our soil. It can be soil erosion, but then think of the process whereby it has taken for that soil erosion to occur. Maybe we can say that soil erosion to occur, it has taken that area 5 years or more than 5 years. It was happening gradually. People were cutting down trees. That's a slow onset disasters. And then we have a sudden onset disaster. Okay? So when we're talking of a sudden onset disaster, sudden onset disasters, they are triggered by hazardous events that emerges quickly or unexpectedly. They are triggered by a sudden event. They're triggered by a hazardous event that emerges quickly and unexpectedly. So those are a sudden onset disasters. Okay? So it doesn't take time to experience these disasters. They are unplanned. They just happen suddenly. What can be an example of that kind of a disaster? What can be an example of a sudden onset disaster? They happen unexpectedly and quickly. Because when we're talking of floods, yes, but then there are types of floods. So if we say flash floods, that one can be a good example. Thunderstorms. Okay, yeah, that one can be a sudden and unexpectedly. Yes. Earthquake. Yes, can be one of the sudden onset. We have volcano eruption. You don't plan, it just happens unexpectedly. So you can also include road accidents is one of the disasters. Remember, when talking of a disaster is something that have got a serious damage on humans, okay? So road accident is also a disaster. So they happen unplanned and quickly. If you don't have questions, I'm moving to disaster loss database. Disaster loss database. So when talking of a disaster loss database, this one is a system. This system mainly is used to collect information about disaster occurrence. A system used to collect information about disaster occurrence, damages, losses, and impacts. So that one is called a disaster loss database. Because if you be working as disaster officers, disaster risk management officers, you need to have this database. You need to keep information about disaster occurrence, the losses, the damages, okay, so that you can refer for future. You can be able to make plans on how a certain area is being affected with droughts. You can be able to trace the frequency of occurrence of a disaster in a certain community. That's our disaster loss database. You have to know where, when, and measures of rescuing people. So keep all those information in one file that is called a disaster loss database. Then you have emergency management. This word emergency is used interchangeably with disaster. Sometimes they use hazardous event. So you can use emergency, hazardous event, or disaster. But then here, you're trying to define emergency management. What is an emergency? So although we are saying that this term is used interchangeably, emergency is different from a disaster. An emergency is different from a hazardous event. So an emergency can also be a hazardous event. Yes. I've not yet tackled disaster management. I've not yet tackled disaster management. So in terms of emergency management, yes, it is a hazardous event. But then this hazardous event does not lead to a serious disruption of the functioning of a community. Are we together? A disaster is something that leads to a serious disruption. But an emergency is something that does not lead to any disruption of the functioning of a community. So, but then still it's a disaster. You need to manage it. That's why it's emergency management. You need to manage still a disaster. So I can give an example of a broken bridge. There's a bridge in Ngona. People use that bridge maybe for transportation, okay? But then, let's say you just wake up finding out that that bridge is broken. That means, but still people find other alternatives. They'll find other routes, okay, to reach their destination. That's why we are saying that it does not lead to a serious, does not lead to the, does not stop the functioning of the community, okay? It's not a serious one. People still find other alternatives of reaching their destination, but still, you need to manage that disaster. You need to reconstruct a bridge so that people can still use it. Are we together? That's an emergency management. Disaster management. Disaster management. Looking at disaster management, This is the organization, planning, and application of measures. You organize, you plan, and you apply measures, whereby these measures, they help you to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disaster. So a simple definition of disaster management can be the organization, the planning, and application of measures to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. So in disaster management, there are 3 technical terms. What do you think are these terms? No? What do you think are these terms? So one of the terms is preparing, responding, and recovering. So in disaster management, you need to sit down and prepare. You need to recover. You need to prepare, you need to respond, and then you recover. So this planning, you don't plan when the disaster is occurring. That's wrong. You plan before the disaster occurs. So those people who are disaster management officers, they have planned for this rain season last year. Okay? So you plan in advance, using those records that you keep in your disaster loss database. Okay, let's check in our disaster loss database. Which areas are more affected by disasters? So you go back to the disaster database. Okay, there is Nsanje, there is Area 23, and there is Salima. So let's plan. Maybe these areas are going to experience disasters next season. We need to plan. How are we going to help them? And then after your plans, you wait for the rain season, and then you find out that those areas are indeed affected by floods. So you need to go there and respond. You need to go there and respond to the hazardous event. Let's say floods, let's say volcanoes. Okay, you go there and respond. So you respond during the occurrence of the disaster. Are we together? You respond during. Ndio nchifake maona organizations za kupita kusanje kuja to rescue people. Okay, to evacuate people to a safer place. That's responding. Our vision napeleka ma biscuit ma energy agent to help those people who are affected by floods. That's responding to a disaster. You respond during the occurrence of the disaster. And then after the disaster is when you go and recover. So recovery, there's a lot in recovery. Because one, those people who are affected by disasters, they pass through traumatized events. They're traumatized with these hazardous events. So you need to provide counseling sessions with them. Some of them, they lost their relatives, their husbands, their spouses, their children. So you need to provide them with counseling. We have talked of evacuation that happens during the responding period. Those people, you just evacuate them to a safer place, right? But then maybe you put them in tents. You need to provide them with proper houses. So that's recovered. They have to recover whatever they have lost. To help them to recover. So that is all involved in disaster management. That will take us to disaster risk. Disaster risk. On tongue of a disaster risk, This is the potential loss of life, destroyed or damaged assets, the loss of life, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, society, or a community in a specific period of time. It could occur to a system, a society, or a community, which could occur in a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So disaster risk is a potential loss of life, damaged or destroyed assets, which could occur to a system, to a society, or a community in a specific period of time. But then this loss of life, this damage of property, probabilistically they can be there due to maybe vulnerability or exposure or capacity of that community. Okay? On this definition, for you to understand it, I'll use an example of you suffering from malaria. Okay? That's a result of something. Because why can you suffer from malaria? There are possibilities. One possibility can be that maybe you are not using mosquito repellents. You choose not to sleep under mosquito nets. You choose not to cover the pit latrines. So the end result is that mosquitoes will bite you and you suffer from malaria. Okay? The same with disasters. For disaster to occur, it may be that that community is vulnerable, is exposed to a certain condition, and that condition, if it occurs, it will lead to loss of life, damage properties or systems. Okay, because you have exposed yourself to that condition. If whenever you want to build a house, you need to know the direction of where the wind blows. Okay, and then when you're constructing your house, the back of your house should face the direction. Okay, komano okumanga akuzali mphepo imachokera direction iyi ukumanga nyumba yawe kuchokera konko, nyumba it will be easy for that house to collapse ma strong winds akamanga blow. Okay, you have exposed yourself to a certain condition, to a certain hazardous condition. You have made yourself vulnerable to that condition. So that was just an example of a disaster risk. You expose yourself, you make yourself vulnerable to a certain disaster, and that the end result or the impact of that disaster will be loss of life, damaged assets, because you have made yourself vulnerable to that condition. I think I've made myself clear on disaster risk. I'm moving to disaster risk governance. Disaster risk governance is a system of institutions, mechanisms, a system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks. It is a system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks, and other arrangements to guide, coordinate, and oversee disaster risk reduction. It is a system of institutions, mechanisms, policies, and legal frameworks and other arrangements to guide, oversee, coordinate risk reduction and related areas of policy. So in terms of disaster risk governance, it's not a one body, it's a combination of different bodies that are looking to mitigate the impacts of disasters. So it can be institutions sitting together, okay, making policies on how to reduce the impacts of disasters. Or you can come up with a framework of how to reduce these impacts of disasters. So a combination of all those people who are working to mitigate the impacts of disasters, they fall under disaster risk governance. So the aim of this disaster risk governance is to reduce related impacts of disasters. Sometimes they oversee. They have their machines or the system to oversee that maybe next year Nsanje is going to experience floods, or maybe Nsanje is going to experience droughts. That's why you hear them in radio stations announcing that you have to keep your food, there'll be hunger next year, there'll be droughts, or you have to evacuate to a safer place, you're going to have floods next year, because they have their own system that oversee a disaster in the coming season. So all those people working to mitigate these impacts of disasters, they fall under disaster risk governance. Then you have disaster risk management. Disaster risk management. What do you think disaster risk management is all about? Because of discussed disaster, types of disasters, the small instead, the large, the frequent and the infrequent. We have talked of disaster loss database. We have talked of disaster risk. We have talked of disaster management, emergency management. What could be the definition of disaster risk management? We are going to finish with this definition. What do you think can be the definition of a disaster risk management? Yes.
It's a process where they find ways to manage disaster damages.
Okay. She's saying that it's a what?
It's a process whereby they find out a way to manage disaster damages.
Okay. They try to find ways of managing disaster losses. That's what I'm saying.
In other way, to find ways to reduce damages, loss that disasters cause.
Okay. Yes, my friend. What's your opinion on this definition? Okay, there are measures used to respond to disasters. Can that be under disaster management? Anyway, because it's just your idea, right? So I take it. Mason.
They go into the because they find the way of how they can solve the problem that comes by them.
Okay. They sit together, go into details. I don't know what details, but then they go into the details to find measures on how to solve a certain problem that has come due to disasters. You people are brilliant. Okay. Yes, what about your definition on disaster risk management? So they respond to that risk. All right, that's also a nice definition. What's your definition? So yeah, you're not all far from the definition, and even if you write your definitions, I'll still give you marks because you're not running away from the term disaster. Okay, so when talking of disaster risk management, it is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. The application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new risks, reduce existing risks, reduce existing disaster risks, and manage residual risks. So that's disaster risk management. Remember, we talked of the disaster risk governance, whereby a group of people sitting together making policies. So in disaster risk management, you try to apply those policies so that you should reduce the impact of disasters. If the disaster have not yet occurred, you try to stop the occurrence of that disaster, or to find out measures to deal with that disaster, so that application of policies falls under disaster risk management.